Vous vous êtes tous réveillés de très bonne humeur. C'est un plaisir pour moi de revenir ici pour vous interpréter d'autres morceaux. Et pour aujourd'hui, je tiens à vous jouer un morceau qui s'intitule Bani. Bani signifie le refus. Le son Bani évoque la guerre entre les peuples musulmans contre le royaume du Gabou, et notamment de cette guerre déclenchée vers la fin du 19e siècle. Il s'agit de la guerre de Manda. En 1865, le roi du Gabou, Djankewali, avait envoyé des messagers au village de Manda, où vivaient les Soninké, qui étaient pour la plupart d'entre eux des chevaux. Et les Soninké ont voulu convertir à l'islam les envoyés du roi Djankewali. Et ces derniers ont refusé. Et les Soninké ont commencé à les tuer un à un parce qu'ils n'ont pas voulu se convertir à l'islam. C'est dans ce contexte que le son Bani a été inspiré et créé. Merci.
Good morning, everyone. Until you respond, we are not proceeding. Good morning, everyone. Merci. Nangadef. Good. Professor Wole Soyinka is ready to join us. So we are going to bring him up. I just want to make sure that everybody is settled and we are ready to go. Our friend will continue entertaining us for about 3 to 4 minutes as Professor Soyinka comes to join us. I hope yesterday went well. It was impossible to see all of you in one room, but it's good to see you in one room today. So welcome to the 4th day of the General Assembly. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. You must greet me. I don't know why it's too difficult for you to greet me this morning. Good morning, everyone. That sounds like it. I want to welcome you to the fourth day of our 15th General Assembly of CODESRIA. And without much ado, I'm going to ask Professor Mahmood Mamdani, who is chairing this session, to take over. Professor Mahmood Mamdani doesn't need introduction, former president of CODESRIA, and he knows how to handle this session. So, Professor Mamdani.
Since you've said such a vigorous good morning, I won't repeat it. Our honorable guest, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. When I sat down to write down some notes to introduce our speaker, I had to ask myself, why did it take CODESRIA 45 years to offer Wole Soyinka a platform at a General Assembly? As I began to think of why, I realized it says more about us than it does about our speaker. So allow me to begin with a few words about ourselves. The core membership of CODESRIA is drawn from political scientists and economists, with a sprinkling of historians and anthropologists. At its foundation, we were like a born-again group of political economists. We wrote and spoke as real or imagined advisors to newly independent governments. Whether or not we identified with power, our language was policy-oriented. We understood society from the outside. Our gaze was surgical, like that of a doctor facing a patient. There was little in the writing of social scientists that told you about the lives of ordinary people. Anyone who wanted to know about life in independent Africa, sooner or later, had to put aside social science literature, the serious stuff, and begin reading what we call literature in ordinary language. It is our writers, not our scholars, who had their finger on the pulse of society. The scholars had turned prescriptive, but the writers continued to describe, to hold a mirror so we could see ourselves. There was little formal exchange between these two groups. This is one reason this lecture is particularly significant. But that is, of course, not the only reason. An even more important reason is the person of our speaker, Akinwande Oluwole Babatunde Soyinka, and what he has come to represent. Playwright, poet, novelist, activist, educator, and essayist. Wole is a man who respects no borders. Audacious, even at times outrageous, but always original. He's never intimidated. The world knows him as the first African to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature in 1984. Born in 1934 in Yoruba land, Wole Soyinka is a vigorous and productive 84. He studied in Nigeria and the UK and then worked with the Royal Court Theatre in London. His plays were produced in theatres and on radio in both Nigeria and the UK. Wole is a man of his word. Not just the word he writes, but also the word he speaks. He dares to say what he thinks and to act as he speaks. In 1965, when he reached the conclusion that the regional elections in Western Nigeria should be cancelled, he seized the Western Nigeria Broadcasting Service studio and demanded that the elections indeed be cancelled. Governments have trembled at the prospect of being called to account by Soyinka's incisive tongue. Their preferred mode of action has been to lock him up. The federal government arrested him in 1967 during the Civil War. Yakubu Gowon kept him in solitary confinement for 2 years. Sani Abacha proclaimed a death sentence against him, a little too late because Wole had already escaped on a motorcycle. Soyinka has said his writing is concerned with, quote, the oppressive boot and the irrelevance of the color of the foot that wears it. Wole Soyinka was a professor of comparative literature from 1975 to 1999 at the University of Ife, now called the Obafemi Awolowo University. He was made Professor Emeritus in 1999. He has been acknowledged and acclaimed widely around the world. He was Goldwin Smith Professor for African Studies and Theatre Arts at Cornell from 1988 to 1991, and then Robert W. Woodruff Professor of the Arts at Emory. He has also taught at Oxford, Harvard, and Yale. He maintains a continuing connection with Harvard. In 2008, he was a distinguished scholar in residence at Duke University. I could go on, and that would not do justice to why we're here. Besides the Nobel, he was awarded the Europe Theatre Prize in December 2017. The committee singled out his contribution to the realization of cultural events that promote understanding and the exchange of knowledge between peoples. For us, Wole Soyinka is a seer, a fighter, and a communicator, all rolled into one. I'm pleased to present you, Wole Soyinka.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I think I should begin by exonerating CODESRIA for my tardiness in joining you at one of your conferences. It was not for want of trying. Something else happened or the other last moment or nearly last moment, and found myself obliged to cancel. This time, however, I was cornered, ambushed very efficiently by some people whom I will not mention here. One of them is on that podium, and a promise was exacted from me, and I knew that this time absolutely nothing should stand in the way of my finally fulfilling this multi-decades invitation, this engagement. So, very difficult theme this, and I've extracted my own area of tiny competence in globalization and on Africa. And I've called this Imperial to Global, Ibadan to Beijing and back. Now, no matter what subject it is that carries economic implications, my preference is to leave it to the experts and seek refuge among that class of humanity generally known as the man in the street, or in Nigeria media parlance, Johnny Bus Stop. I've added a few personal variations of my own to that pyramidal base of overall society. I use terms such as Alabide farm, or street hawker worker, etc., etc. And since I happen to roam basically in the field of the creative arts, and this occasion is dedicated to the late poet, statesman, and grand patron of the arts, Leopold Sedar Senghor, I shall make my entry into a theme through a representative of that occupation, the artist Waka Waka. It acknowledges that the theme of globalization implicates us all, the factory worker, the bus stop, the farmer, street hawker, school teacher, bricklayer, engineer, doctor, and all. That entry point is concocted from a rather morbid landscape, one that, however, constitutes a familiar national environment. It's a trajectory which I'm convinced no trained economist could possibly have conceived. If I'm wrong, then that exceptional economist should give up his or her profession and take to the creative enterprise. I propose through the fictional yet truthful scenario that in globalization we're not dealing with any new phenomenon, but a heightened transformation of operations within a timeless human enterprise. How we respond to the impact of its contemporary formation is, of course, another matter entirely, and often has serious consequences for our humanity. We shall leave the experts to delineate in detail the complex processes of the transformation. It is the consequences that matter to Alabide Farm or Street Hawker Waka and others, and which hang over even the future of their children and of the continent. Here goes. Assume that you're a sculptor whose medium is essentially metal, and that you live in Nigeria, a land richly endowed with motor wrecks and thus an abundance of scrap iron. Apart from the material itself, those mangled shapes may even provide you with seeming arbitrariness, unusual forms, images, and compositional options. Of course, you'll also be in competition with the professional scrap iron dealers, panel beaters, and welders, etc. But let's stick to our artistic exemplar for now, a sculptor who's obsessed with extracting and expressing his cultural insights in a new idiom, even perhaps attempting to manifest it in an original form, let us say the inner capture of negritude. Curiously, not curiously by coincidence, I was at the National Museum yesterday, and at the entry was an iron cast tree of civilization, a very Senghorian kind of concept I just made entirely out of art, and I smiled, and I said, do you know why I'm smiling? And my dear guide said, no. I said, it so happens that this sculpture here is where I intend to begin tomorrow. So let's go along. The single-minded artistic concern will make our sculpture very likely, it will preclude him from mundane speculations such as an exploding motor tire made from latex gathered from the rubber plantation of Asaba in Midwest Nigeria, but manufactured perhaps in Poland, that this was perhaps responsible for turning the highway into a vehicle cemetery. By contrast, your supposedly illiterate mechanic, the Mr. Johnny bus stop, whom you consult for repairs on your motor car or on your welding equipment, will very likely ask you, Oga, you want the genuine spare part or you want made in Taiwan? Or some such locally demonized source of suspect quality. The economics involved in that question, for we lay people, we know enough to be able to assert that they are complex, far-reaching, and quite sophisticated. It's then up to you to decide whether you prefer to bite the bullet at once, both for a quality, guaranteed replacement, or else you pay for it later somehow. That mechanic proves as well-traveled and world-savvy without having left his Alaba workshop as well-traveled as that sculptor, a veteran of international biennales, certainly no less globalized in outlook. All these actors in the universal drama of occupational existence are linked together in an industrial and commercial, socially transformative continuum whose workings remain open-ended, ever-expanding, all depending on the fortunes of the produced commodity. That commodity could be Swiss chocolate from cocoa beans harvested in Ondo farms, Dunlop tires from the latex of Asaba's plantations. It could be fiery ketchup, now mass-produced in America or in British factories from Ghana's Maposhito. The textiles which are churned out from Manchester mills may have created bankruptcy, thus closing down once vibrant garment factories of Kaduna, resulting in massive layoffs whose army of unemployed then expand the migratory hordes of beggars in urban centers. No sooner are they repatriated than they regroup, reinvade, leaving behind those who answer the recruitment drives of the myrmidons of the theocratic global alliance of power-driven zealots, such as Boko Haram. That connectedness of globalism's cyclic trajectory is how my holistic tendency attempts to come to grips with the dynamic, the sometimes deleterious, suddenly unpredictable, and often unconscious participation and geographies, material and human, in the interlocking community of producers, suppliers, and consumers, at once positive and negative, suspect and seductive, involving fluctuations, fluctuating profit and loss, equitable and exploitative partnerships. It's an ancient story of the value transformation of objects into negotiable commodities. What is gained in the swings is lost in the roundabouts, etc., etc. The interaction of the players in social functioning is one that is common to all societies and to members, even as many of these players, all of us, many of us remain unaware or indifferent to the role of their co-players and the implications of such roles. Excuse me. A clever handful, however, managed to get in control of the process. They direct it. They act, they set the wheels rolling, and simply co-opt their auxiliary players as they go along. The implications are felt, however, in the deeper reaches of society and may lead to the collapse of some societies or the enhancement of the quality of its members. It all depends. The sculptor, his artist, may believe that he is encased in an autonomous world of creative production. His attitude towards the economics of his trade may even be condescending. He or she is, however, part of that chain of the marketing adventure, once rudimentary, personalized, but one that has become increasingly shorn of personal relationships and moved towards a globalized complexity. But it is there. It has always been thus with humanity. I doubt if anyone, even of my generation, can claim to have been completely insulated from the global nature of commodities, however tangential, even if one grew up in the most pristine village. It included even services. For instance, in my paternal village, Ishara, you are most likely to encounter a board advertising the services of an expert London tailor, even though everyone knew that he had never traveled beyond the precincts of that red laterite town. But in actual fact, he's also competing. He's trying to match the claims of the originals themselves, you know, the genuine article. British tailors who were patronized by the up-and-coming lower middle class through the glossy and exotic mail-order industry, of which the most vivid in my childhood recollection was called Leonard's Order Catalog. That's where my father used to shop. Now, during that very same phase, and we're speaking here of the late 30s and early 40s, we had in full operation foreign trading companies such as the United Africa Company, UAC, John Holt, Unilever Brothers, SCOA, I think called in Francophonie, Akua, and Kingsway Stores, all of whose agents penetrated deep into the interior to trade directly with the primary producers. Human carriers were being replaced by lorries and railways that transported local products to exotic places via the agents of those trading companies. The exchange system was rudimentary, limited, but effective for its time. The foreign participation occupied the same space as the traditional market with largely agricultural and other locally manufactured produce. Let it be noted also that these market women formed commodity guilds, regulated prices, battled with transporters, and haggled with their customers. They have since been replaced, of course, by the supermarket and then by the mega plazas. Of course, even before then, that phase, matters had become somewhat more complex and sometimes far more exciting as the nation approached independence. At independence, that part of Nigeria in which I was born and raised, the Western region, had also transformed the traditional produce and marketing guilds into a cooperative system where farmers and artisans brought their goods to the headquarters in Ibadan, either directly or through their local units. They obtained guaranteed prices for them and were able not only to maintain an above-average existence, but to enjoy the social services and infrastructures that fired their productive zeal. From the profits of their production and marketing organizations, the Western Regional Government actually erected the first skyscraper in Ibadan, known as Ilegogoro, but formerly called Cocoa House. And why was it called that? Simply to acknowledge the source of the wealth that created that skyscraper, and also to make the farmers and the producers feel part of the ownership of those urban structures. The management of wealth resulted in the first free education program up to secondary school level, and even they awarded scholarships from which the children of those farmers and market women, among others, were able to travel overseas to overseas institutions for specialized courses that did not then exist in Nigeria of the 50s and 60s. Eventually, that same regional government, instituted one of the earliest state universities in the nation, the University of Ife. I was a beneficiary at that stage of one of the scholarships. And bear in mind also, and this is important, that at the time, with hardly any exception, we could not wait to return with whatever our brains have been stuffed with, ready to utilize any relevant part of that stuffing into what we already had determined was our destiny, our soul calling, national transformation. That was then. But at that time again, that generation, members of that generation, will testify that something then happened to a system for which the political slogan, life more abundant, actually had literal meaning. Hence the attention that I drew to the fact that some of the most accomplished manpower of the nation, even today, technocrats, diplomats, scientists, intellectuals, are actually the children of those peasants, the elementary school teachers, lower grade civil servants, including office messengers, most of whom until then had led a marginalized existence, actually even despised existence. Cocoa, palm oil and kernels, shea butter, rubber, gum arabica, groundnuts, etc., had become internationally sought commodities on which the industrialized nations relied for a number of their own factory line products. However, all it took was a regime change in the Western region, and we plunged into a deterioration of that productive system, which one had expected would become even more consolidated, enhancing productivity with the introduction of new technology and an opening into a wider global economic order. Instead, however, and here's where we are today, the very opposite took place. The condition of the farming population became so intolerable that organized militancy began, no less than a peasant revolt. It became known by the name Agbekoya, meaning the farmer rejects misery. Agbekoya was a guerrilla movement that threatened the regional government. It invaded the ancient city of Ibadan, overran even some institutions. Hundreds of them were held in Ibadan in the Agodi prison, the farmers, peasants, only for the government to wake up one day and find that that ancient colonial holding pen had been stormed and the inmates freed. Well, the French revolutionaries may boast of their storming of the Bastille. We had our own storming of Agodi in Ibadan. The West became known, in the words of one incoming dictator later on, as the Wild, Wild West. As if that turmoil was not sufficiently complicated, Nigeria entered the military stage, and yet another transformation of the production system, wrong priorities, etc., etc. Eventually, even that military government had to negotiate with the Agbekoya this took place right during the Biafran War of Secession. Now, how does it happen in the first place? Why does a seemingly satisfactory production, distribution, and exchange system find itself time and time again under siege, buffeted, overwhelmed, then replaced by forces from another production pattern? Well, let us be realistic. It is in the nature of humanity to expand, be it geographically or through its products, including the cultural. When you produce, you seek avenues for disposing of your surplus. You have to offload it somewhere. It then becomes a question of whose intervention enables it to dictate the produce value and to what the primary producers, who, after all, commenced the chain, are entitled as just returns. Empire building is how it all commences, seeking new markets outside the immediate geography of production in ever-widening circles, and establishing controls, either directly or through surrogates, among whom might even be, ironically, the original primary producers. The more distanced from the fate of their commodity, the more disempowered and alienated such producers become. Intermediaries take their cut. They become organized into consortiums, and of course, the middlemen, women, they strike out on their own. They plant a trick or two. And so the primary producers are left in the lurch. Intermediary interest, after all, is to garner profits while avoiding or diminishing the returns, or what we use the expression, return to sender. They stop returning to sender. That was the meaning and the lessons of Agbekoya, or the ever-recurrent unrest in Nigeria's oil-producing Delta region. And do note, by the way, that we use my nation merely as reference point. The scenario is replicated in the post-independence history of much of the continent. To this day, alas, for better or for worse, that expansionist impulse, under whatever name, dominates global interactions, co-opting the globe into a system in which the intermediary means the finance becomes the primary produce. This contention was most vividly manifested in 2007 and 2008 by the effects a worldwide financial crisis, which I'm sure we all remember, that emanated from the financial nerve center known as Wall Street. The paving stones of that famous street began to crack, and the first sounds triggered off seismic occurrences across the globe, sowing panic even in economies that had given the impression of enjoying autonomous self-regulation with strong, internal, diversified produce buffer zones of their own. When Wall Street sneezes, the world was learning, the world catches cold. Or perhaps it was China that sneezed, and Wall Street then caught the virus and then infected the rest of the world with the germs. Now, why China? A decade and a half before that financial meltdown, I would likely have singled out Japan. However, the Chinese, having slowly but firmly built up their capital reserves, ironically, largely through the export of cheaply produced commodities to both Western and Third World consumer markets, felt prepared to commence their massive inroads into the ever-obliging African continent. This took place in a steady, structured manner. No fuss, no fanfare. On the surface, mere unconnected forays to begin with, but anything but. Now, the Chinese appeared to be undeterred by the often nauseous vestments of their sleeping partners in power. This is, of course, a serious issue, one that is of concern to, and has been taken up by a number of civic movements, both publicly and privately. The hypocrisy of the challenged monopolists of the West, however, is even more nauseous. I recall that when the campaign against the Chinese Olympics hotted up, especially when the Chinese tacit support for the criminal regime of Omar Bashir in Sudan was moved to the fore as a rallying banner, I was obliged to make it clear to a number of pressure groups that while I was itching for concerted international action to end the conduct of the Sudanese government against its African indigents, I most certainly could not support a call for a boycott of the Chinese Olympics. Tibet, of course, was used as a rallying point, but the commencement of a Chinese commercial empire was the real basic issue. Now, there are always available optional partnership models from which to learn or adapt, enabling a modicum of control over the process. Take, for instance, when the British decided to phase out their factories for some British motor car icons. You may remember Rolls-Royce, Aston Martin, and even the workhorse Morris Minor. India negotiated with those firms for the retention of their spare parts production. I may be inaccurate over details, but I was a student at the time, and I owned a jalopy. I bought it for 25 pounds at the time, and that I learned to fix for myself. And so I actually witnessed this process of the transfer of the spare part manufacturing industry to India. I didn't know the significance of it at the time, but later I would recall when the process began to take place. From being a client appendage to one of the couple of manufacturing companies in the United Kingdom, India took over and went full tilt into spare parts manufacturing on a large scale. So the original producers themselves simply transferred orders to their offshore partners in India while they turned their attention to some other brand of the motoring manufacturer. But of course, the choice of India as partners was not arbitrary or accidental. That is the point. Mind you, I must be careful about which came first, the chicken or the egg. All I can have said is that it was about the same time, and I refer here to the 1950s and then 60s, that the phenomenon of India's small manufacturing took off, resulting eventually in the famous Inventors' Village, which at least I can boast of having visited. The contrast with my own Nigeria was quite remarkable. We're comparing models here. It was remarkable. while we were thrashing around the jungles of a place called Ajaukuta, trying to set up a pachyderm of an iron and steel industry, India was deep into the small machine manufacturing, supplying the industrialized West with its spare parts, then developing its own technology. By contrast, we in Nigeria, we took to partnering with one Western, then Eastern, then Asian, then went back to Russian, one after the other, to replicate obsolete production methods of those advanced nations. The result, billions and billions of dollars down the drain in manufacturing complex taken over by the jungle, and not one single steel ingot, not one iron sheet to show for an industry that was inaugurated half a century ago. By contrast, India moved to an atomic capability, then to the space age, into the space age. Her satellites are orbiting the globe as we speak. New rockets being prepared to probe whichever of the planets next takes her fancy. They'll probably monitor Richard Branson's commercial Virgin space shuttles as they circumnavigate the Earth in outer space. In a moment, more about Mr. Richard Branson. So, any space program to boast of on this continent? Well, I'm just asking. Where, to make it quite modest, are locally manufactured technological facilitators for a modest cottage industry? Yes, there are one or two now poking the surface of the continent, but very few. But I'll tell you what the answer to that question is, where they mainly are. Those facilitators, those new technologies. They're lodged in the skeletons and desiccated skulls lining the Sahara route, in the whitened skulls of Gabonese, Ivorians, Ugandans, Senegalese, Ghanaians, Togolese, Malians, Nigerians, Ethiopians, Eritreans, etc., augmenting sea life of the Mediterranean Sea. And let's not forget also, scattered to the four winds by the fundamentalist wastrels who wish to build the city of God on earth, but cannot even begin by constructing a modern village of man on this material earth. They are, however, experts at using the very weapons that they cannot manufacture themselves for decimating the very potential that begs to be released and empowered for the development of a continent. Yes, they appear to be true practitioners of the transfer of technology, the technology of human destruction, especially the conversion of raw yet finished human material to the services of mass annihilation, the suicide bomber. For now, however, let's try and remove our field of exploration from the morbid trajectory. We know what to do if we choose to mobilize our collective will. It's a large subject, and perhaps organizations such as this, we consider tackling this crisis in depth at some future gathering. That affliction of a will to theocratic globalization, in practice to the globalization of terror, has taken on a dimension of an implacable and urgent resolve that brooks no further avoidance on any level of continental consciousness. Some nations, such as mine, are on the brutal, nation-eviscerating receiving end. We choose to pretend that this is a localized challenge. They are wrong. And once again, the primary victims are Mr. Johnny Bostop, Alabi Day Farm, etc., all of that broad pyramidal base that we earlier identified. The victims are also generations yet unborn and human advance. They constitute a real and present danger to the very existence of humanity. It's a menace that cannot be paid mere glancing attention. And so for now, let us bypass it and return to more graspable, accessible predicament. As it is with the sculptor in his cast-off ironmongery, so with the athlete and the sporting community. Scratch any of the most prestigious US universities, and you will hit the sensitive flesh and nerve of a commercial empire. Those colleges, fortunately, also enable us to appreciate that globalization is not only exocentric, that is, radiating outwards, but also endogenous, operating internally. Take a university in the States where I once taught, Emory University, Atlanta. And there you find yourself within the heart of the Coca-Cola empire. Now, across the American landmass, to universities such as Stanford in California, and the map of learning reveals itself as a quiltwork of rivaling imperial turfs. Are they content to let the status quo be and enter into a pact of non-aggression between the colored patches that demarcate the scattered territories of Imperial Coke or its rival, the preppy Pepsi? The answer is no. From time to time, you'll find that the blotches on the map have changed. Some have disappeared altogether, others fused, as one university signs a new pact of allegiance with the imperial product, swearing on its college escutcheon that it will forever forswear the slightest taste of the rival product. The sporting field in nations like the United States now reminds one of the feudal Europe of the 16th and the 17th century, those competitive fields of gold where French and British ruling houses vied with each other in the rights of splendor. Today, however, it's Michael Jordan versus Hellfinger, tomorrow Nike and Adidas in deadly struggle for the soul, spelled both ways, of college sports. And God help any member of a team who wears the colors of the enemy empire. It's a winner-take-all, and the victor moves on towards its ideal, college takeovers and consolidation side by side, or in the wake of global conquest. I do not frankly recall which one comes first. Now, that model, which I've just offered so that we actually grasp the practicalities of this globalization, that model extends even to the outside world. Again, I recall towards the end of 1986, Coca-Cola signed a pact with the Soviet Union with all the formal fanfare, not merely of an ideological breakthrough, but of an accord between two forces, to all appearances equal and opposite. The Soviet Union was still under communist rule. Yet such was the gravity of that occasion, I've never forgotten it, that one felt that it was a treaty between two distinct empires, and perhaps it was to a large extent. Needless to say, the rival products, Pepsi, Sprite, and others, were not slow to seek out their own foreign territories. One headed for China, I remember, the Soviet Union's challenger for communism's imperial crown. Another territory, Saudi Arabia, fell to some other product, I forget which one, soon trumped by the acquisition of Qatar, or somewhere close by, for the leftovers. The so-called doctrine of free trade proved to be a euphemism for a ruthless contest over turf, few prisoners taken. Diversification of products was really a cover for acquisitions that led to the establishment of mega companies, multinationals, consortiums, ensuring that control was kept strictly within what we may consider as the extended globalized family. Every commercial move on a global scale can be paralleled by what we know of the history of political empires. Instead of Ottoman, Russian, Roman, or British empires, simply read Lehman, Enron, Hearst, or Murdoch, etc., and now increasingly Neo-Sino. Even the book world has not been permitted a modest, inviolate space. Let me testify from my own personal experience in that regard. After all, writers also sometimes get parceled up and marketed with other commodities, just like athletes. Just when over 2 decades ago, I thought I was settling down to my new publishing family, Frassinelli, in Italy. It got swallowed up by some three-headed monster whose name I refuse to remember. I happen to like small publishing houses. I didn't hesitate in escaping even Oxford University Press when these were my earliest publishers, when my editors in OUP went on to Methuen. And then I moved out again with one of them, Rex Collins, who formed his own company, set up his own publishing house. His office was in Paddington Street, London. And I recall it ended up, as it was progressively bankrupted, it ended up in the basement of that building, Underground Warren, where his partner, Ian Coulthard, grew mushrooms. I don't think that the mushrooms had anything to do with their going bankrupt, but bankrupt they went, owing me some 3 years in royalties. So maybe there's something to be said for sticking to mega companies after all. No matter, I moved back in with Methuen. The next thing I knew, that modest publishing house vanished overnight, though not without a struggle that resulted in a reduced specialist unit still bearing the name of Methuen. In the main, however, it was sucked into the maw of a new publishing entity appropriately named Octopus Books. The unkindest cut of all, however, was that the new mergers no longer produce and sell only books. And I'm not speaking here of my British eccentric who grew mushrooms in the office cellars. In any case, he didn't sell the stuff. He just grew it because it was damp there, and mushrooms grow in damp atmosphere. We're speaking here, in fact, of large corporate entities called publishing houses that now market both designer and general consumer goods, even as oil companies diversified into the world of sporting goods and banana plantations. These are the globalizing forces of our time, gobbling up geographical territories as far as they swallow commercial products, unified, ironically, by the very diversity of their commercial interests. So that when looking at the imperial map of the world today, I'm never quite sure which would be the best representation. It can be either as a series of interlocking circles or as a stack of transparencies, each laid on top of the other, with goods superimposed on real estate, oil blocks between pineapple plantations, chain stores, and merging ownership dynasties slip between all of them. It's all so confusing. The once famous media empires, and they were indeed known by that name, empires, are not exempt. One wakes up one day to find that the staid, or if you prefer, the serious newspapers, such as that bulwark of the best of British tradition, the Times of London, have been taken over by the tabloid empire, luridly lorded over by the Daily Mirror or News of the World. I'm going back some years now, with predictable results. Scratch a media house today, and you find that it bleeds oil, bitumen, or suntan lotions, and has whopping shares in the tourist industry, with a hotel chain, casino, and mud spas. Now we know where the mud comes from in those lurid tabloid papers. Should anyone have been surprised when 2 decades ago, one of the youngest and most adventurous airlines, Virgin Atlantic, took on the stodgy, ancient, empire-oriented company known as the British Airways, then proceeded to push the boundaries of imperial holdings beyond the British frontiers, from Virgin Atlantic to Virgin America, Virgin Colombia, to, believe it or not, Virgin Nigeria. Is there perhaps a Virgin Senegal that I don't know about? By the time this conference is finished, maybe you have to book us all on Virgin Africa, going everywhere in the world. Why not? The admirable robber baron, Richard Branson, whom I admire, by the way, is quite an adventurer. He's even venturing into space. It's about to launch its first commercial shuttle. The first trial flight is scheduled to take place, he said, before Christmas. Maybe it's taking place as we are talking grammar here. I don't know. He had, when it came to Virgin Nigeria, he didn't last for very long. I could have warned him, but he has this gift of moving just before things become impossible. So he's moved into, he avoids geographical territory. He deals in brand names, in commodities. So now from Virgin Airlines, Virgin Oil, Virgin Wines, Virgin Records, Virgin Pesto, virgin cigars, virgin spas, resorts, etc. Virginity is today's hottest ensign. Now, the whole world is restitching its hymen to qualify as virgin territory open for imperial penetration. Indeed, a brand new virgin culture appears to be the ultimate agenda, which frankly will be a breath of fresh air from national cultural imperialism. What connects the world today is frankly not even internet, but the unification imperative through commodity brand names, which of course is always an indicative of cultural supersession in the offing, under the aegis of, what else? Globalization. Once Virgin's commercial shuttles begin to fly, shall we be confronted with a totally new entity, new culture, the galactic? But back to this, my own field, which is culture. I must confess that from time to time, one is driven to excess by the need to counter the seeming unstoppable march of, yes, indeed, cultural globalization. Commodity is all very well. Food, clothes, all that very well. But let's speak about culture just for a while. Music is easily the most aggressive in the globalization agenda. And I'll give you my own personal example in this. I recall just about 3 decades ago, when I was driven to distraction by the oral pollution of my Nigerian university campus, which was built and named for an environment that was not merely steeped in Yoruba culture, but one whose mission was to protect and promote that culture. It resulted in my embarking on an instant and drastic cultural sanitation of the environment then under my control. I'd accepted to take charge of an arts complex called Odudua Hall, which is at the University of Ife. Driving into the premises one day, I found myself violently assaulted by one of those banal thump-thump-thumpeted rhythms played at high decibel from a ghetto buster. Difficult to recall today the existence of things called ghetto busters. Everything's been miniaturized for greater torture, because it now plays those noises at a much higher decibel, smaller though it is. An American invention, of course, the ghetto buster. So what happens immediately was that I busted the buster. I think I must have gone a little bit berserk, flung the pieces to the four winds. Now, such bouts of parochial cultural derangement occasionally assail even the sanest, the most accommodating and balanced of us. I suspect once in a lifetime. To restate the obvious, culture is not limited to merely the arts, being far more comprehensive of lifestyles, social ethos, productivity, even leisure modes. So you can just imagine that I felt more than a mere twinge of sympathy and indeed empathy just a few years after my own explosion with that acclaimed French cultural Samson, José Bové. That farmer, some of you may recall, already an avowed enemy of globalized food, sometimes called fast food, entered his bulldozer and demolished the foundations of a new McDonald's outlet that was being erected just outside Paris. That violent eruption was, I believe, unprecedented in Europe. We've never met and are highly unlikely to. So the world is safe from a Franco-Yoruba alliance of cultural terrorism. We can confine ourselves simply to probing the mind of the assailant and others of like disposition, and profit from our findings in mapping out our distinct cultural paths that avoid submerging one's identity under the powerful market forces of others, even while remaining conscious of the reality of global interaction. Time does not permit me to indulge in the exploits of that warrior, whose career I've been following with great interest and sense of entertainment and solidarity. We must return to the central question posed, which is our main concern. concern. Who is primarily privileged by the globalization agenda? We've established that it once was a primary producer, at least that the primary producer was not shortchanged and undervalued, hence those early scenarios I recalled for you. That's only natural justice. However, the pendulum has swung away from that organic logic. Globalization is also equally inevitable. That is admitted. Being a product of human development, be it in the economic or culture, we can deal with the culture, personally if necessary. However, we're confronted with the question, to whom rightly belongs the lion's share of returns from the globalization agenda? I believe that the answer is equally obvious. Right now, it's whoever drives the process, whatever nation, whatever organization drives the process. And the commodity also. It has to be a commodity of global desire. Another qualifier, of course, is the ability to deliver the finished product, the distribution system. This is what bound the sculptor and the motor car manufacturer together. Both were producers, although in different directions. So I ask ourselves today, we've already asked the question, what's our space program? We don't have it. And I ask, is there any commodity that can make us on the African continent even a junior partner in the globalization process? Right now, all I discern is dictation from superior forces, from subtle dictation to in your face. We have always the arts, of course, and dance seems to become very prominent. Everybody's dancing these days. It's amazing. In a different context, I also suggested, especially in that modest work of mine of Africa, I suggested, among other things, the spirituality of Africa. However, a hard-headed world tends towards propositions of far more negotiable commodities. One can only sell what exists, what is recognized as existing. And what we do have in abundance is already acknowledged. Human resources, otherwise known as manpower. Skilled or unskilled, does it matter anymore? Accessing non-human material, obviously resources, etc., maybe it's too strenuous, too difficult, too time-consuming. You actually have to work hard to extract the raw material and then transform it. It requires management, transportation, unpredictable partnership, involves indebtedness, etc. By contrast, the human commodity is more straightforward. You simply create enabling conditions through, ironically, inaction. This requires nothing more strenuous than citizen neglect, marginalization and frustration, and the human commodity exports itself. The state does not even need to lift a finger. Human exportation is already the latest business in town, for those who haven't noticed. The export goes through the desert, goes across the Mediterranean, and even occasionally by air. Now, I know that uninformed and not very bright observers might think that this is what is being proposed is a new phase of the slave trafficking, that dismal history, that dismal history is being repeated all over again, but they are wrong. This is merely Africa's re-entry into global history after the doldrums of immediate post-independence years, when hopes were inordinately high, enthusiasm unbridled, and energies unleashed for the creation of a brave new world. The word Renaissance, last heard during that heady, immediate post-independence era has been leaping back into currency. African Renaissance, to be specific. That really cannot be by chance. Something exceptional must be happening. Some new thinking, some new waves of creative and transformative thinking have obviously led to these human movements in both quantitative and qualitative dimensions, convulsing the African continent from urban centers to rural hinterland, From Johnny Bus Stop to Alabi Day Farm, Hoka Waka has discarded her tray of petty consumer items and taken to the exit trail, likely ending in prostitution on the streets of Italy, Libya, and the Balkans as street corner waka. Designate the movement how you will. It spells the sheer movement of humanity in outward direction. Continue with our case study, since we are notorious for constantly setting the pace in the development of innovations. I'm talking of Nigeria now, which I've submitted myself, sacrificed myself, my own country, as a case study. I can cite to you a formal national stamp on this particular perspective, within which the ongoing migration can be inserted. Let's place at the back of our minds, I tell you this, Sarah, ladies, just 3 migratory waves, and I'll proceed to flesh them out in very brief details. 1, the notorious slave trade, which we mentioned. Involuntary, externally instigated, but with internal collaboration of the infernal middlemen and women, our own kind, selling their own kith and kin. A traffic whose export is reckoned in millions and can be pinpointed as facilitator of development in the Americas and the Caribbean. The second wave, this time voluntary, separated from the first by 3 or 4 centuries. Its export statistics can be reckoned in mere thousands, the result of societal frustrations, lack of professional fulfillment, or political persecution. That was a post-independence phenomenon in the 70s and 80s of the last century. It was generally given the right name, brain drain. Then, this current, third, also voluntary, in quotation marks, an all-comer exodus in all available directions, one that cuts across classes, professions, and nations, but is largely made up of the young, both male and female, under conditions that remind us of that first inhuman and degrading exodus. This third wave is fast catching up in numerical scope with the first. It is now being reckoned in millions. We needn't waste no more time on that first. It is universally repudiated. The second and the third are the ones to focus on because they are our responsibility. Let me tell you just a little bit more about that second wave. Not many of us on this continent know about it, and most Nigerians have forgotten. The Nigerian government, which was a military dictatorship at the time, sat up and took note and actually pronounced itself worried. So specialized was this outward movement, the second one of the 70s and 80s, that was actually called the brain drain. That bothered the government. It set up a special commission. Why was so much human capital moving out of the Nigerian borders? The commission, I forget how strong it was, but you know, we don't do things in a small way in Nigeria, very large commission. It traveled throughout the continent, Europe, America, Soviet Union. It was headed by a rear admiral of the Nigerian Navy. Took off on a world tour. Came back and to find out the causes of the brain drain. I can testify that the brain drain was real. Even long before the government took notice, I continuously interacted in my travels with what amounted to a Nigerian diaspora of a specialized class. I'm speaking of engineers, technicians, of the highest caliber, inventors, clerics, etc., psychiatrists, estate agents, businessmen and women in every branch of enterprise, heads of small businesses. An African once held the position of the chairman of the International Association of Neurosurgeons. I felt proud to be invited by him to deliver a lecture at their annual meeting in Boston. To encounter an African not only working with NASA, but credited with the invention of a critical component of a space shuttle is to obtain the kind of rush that astronauts are said to feel in their spacewalk, and feel indeed vicariously an astronaut. Well then, back to the Grand Brain Drain Commission. After a few months of traipsing through the flesh pots of the world, it concluded its voyage of discovery and presented a report. Our report declared that the analysts were wrong, that there was nothing to worry about. Nigeria was not suffering from a brain drain. Indeed, the report declared, not in those very words, admittedly, that the very opposite was the case, that the nation was suffering from brain surfeit. Too much brain. And thus, that the outward movement was a natural outflow of the brain surplus. Nigeria, the Commission reported, had embarked on a voluntary export of minds, a kind of Nigerian brain corps. I beg your pardon, Peace Corps. Those were the actual words, Peace Corps of the mind. You know, something poor, undeveloped nations like Scandinavia, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, United States, Europe, South Africa, the Caribbean, just helping them to develop. So definitely, that migrant wave of the 70s and 80s was not a reenactment of the slave trade. Motion was in trickles, it was voluntary, it was specialized, a gift of Nigeria to the world of a commodity that that nation obviously did not need for its development, actualization, all part of the African philosophy of hospitality, Ubuntu, negritude, etc., etc. We were witnessing a mass exodus. There's a modicum of good news, however, about this exodus. Europe naturally woke up to the avalanche and has been an avalanche beating at their gates. They've been taking steps various ways. Some are going Brexit, others are building walls against the barbarians, you know, across their landscape, you know, and asking them also to pay for the cost of the walls, etc., etc. But others are genuine. You have a city like Palermo, for instance, whose attitude towards this crisis was actually to create a charter of rights for immigrants. Very, very progressive people. But it is not their responsibility ultimately. The responsibility begins from the export point, from the producers of the primary commodity. The good news is that I understand that some African leaders, heads of state, are responding to the European to hold a meeting, bilateral, multilateral meeting, to try and decide what to do. I can tell them what to do, but nobody will invite me. But never mind that. So hopefully an action plan will come of it. But as I keep insisting, it is the responsibility, primary responsibility of Africans and African leadership. People are rushing out, despite all the dangers, despite all the reports, despite the global prostitution exploitation which is taking place from young women who are looking for quote-unquote greener pastures, or who've been deceived into believing that they're going to work as au pair girls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Despite the risks that even when they are assembled attempting to cross the Mediterranean, they are descended upon by the global Interahamwe, the religious Interahamwe, who arrive, separate the waiting migrants, the believers on one side, the non-believers on the others, and butcher one of them. We cannot have forgotten reports of such events on the shore of Tripoli. And even if we have, then what of the recently exposed official expose on the official detention centers of would-be migrants, those who migrated to Libya? Some of them were described in horrifying details by the advanced team of the present government. Yes, there was yet another commission just last year, went there to probe, to look at the conditions of Nigerians. And one of them broke down in tears and said that what she saw was another Nazi concentration camp. But despite all these reports, the exodus continued. The philosophy of the 70s and 80s, perhaps, being the main motivating factors this exodus continues. Now, the lesson from those two last Nigerian missions, separated by roughly 2 decades and a half, are truly disheartening, albeit in different ways. But what happened during those 2 to 3 decades in between the 2 waves? As the American politicians like to quip, it's the economy, stupid. But was the economy created by the market forces of globalization? I am going to leave that question in the hands of the economic trackers, the specialists. It is the effect, as I said from the beginning, the consequences that can become primarily the concern of us laymen and women. It is there we have to exercise our own conscience and the clamorous yet missing proactive action that this demands. We're speaking here of a seemingly, but actually self-defining value that any self-respecting people ignore at their own peril, the dignity of their members. That dignity is what the continent is losing to the outer world. Dignity, self-respect, pride of race, as well as vital pre-colonial values that validly evoke, yes, here it comes, that sometimes evoke that expression of an ending controversy, negritude, or if you prefer, Ubuntu. I cannot accept that African leadership lacks the correctional intelligence and collaborative will to formulate and commence, for instance, a practical 5-year plan buttressed by a percentage of their national resources, all combined towards ending the caulking of indentations on the Mediterranean shoreline with African brains. I know that those very propulsive forces of globalization, West and East, those primary beneficiaries who are now under siege, under trial, will gladly match or nearly match such voluntary and focused dedication of resources. I doubt if it will ever happen. Such propositions will take their place with hundreds of others gathering dust on the shelves of the Africa Union, lavish headquarters built and donated by China. So let history continue to repeat itself, albeit under a new rubric, globalization. To those in whose commodity demands, this continent remains content to contribute as its quota. What else? The brain power. At least what is left of that commodity after the desert vultures have had their fill and the fishes of the Mediterranean have gorged to their heart's content. To co-opt another Nigerian parlance, congratulate yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thought-provoking, inspiring, and challenging. We have, I think, about half an hour for questions and answers, comments. Try and keep it brief so that the time can be shared by all. Just raise your hand and... Yes, please. Who has the microphone?
Thank you, Professor Wole Soyinka, for that brilliant, exciting, and disturbing keynote. The whole question of humanity is raised in this paper, in this presentation. And I begin to wonder, in the context of your paradoxical vision, that in the context of your paradoxical vision, that human beings from time immemorial will continue to manifest the tragic and the comic. While you are giving the lecture, the most terrible faces of it provoked laughter. And I begin to wonder, because I too am from Nigeria, and the Yoruba say that when a matter is too tragic, people laugh. They just laugh it off. And I think that spirit of endurance, that comic apprehension of life, has itself become a challenge. How do we overcome the tendency to just laugh it off? I could see all the comics in Nigeria, the stand-up comedians, they just make a mockery of the whole situation. And life goes on. Please, what can we do? My question is, you have struggled and struggled and struggled. The situation is getting worse. How do you cope? Especially living in that country called Nigeria. Thank you.
You've asked a very difficult question, but I solved it quite some time ago. And I solved it by saying that by looking at Nigeria, and not just Nigeria alone, it's not alone, not so much as a nation, as a work in progress. And that it's not necessarily a work that'll be finished in my lifetime or in the lifetime of many gray-haired people. And to say, as I have said again and again to the new generation, that it's your nation now. I hope you realize that. And you'd better do something about it. And among the things which can be done is mobilize, get together, and for heaven's sake, take over the nation. Stop joining the bandwagon, because that also has been some of the problem. Just saying that I want my slice of the action, or to use yet again another Nigerian expression, I want my slice of the national cake. And the lack of courage and standing up to an existing system of constantly saying, yes, let's choose the lesser of the two evils. I think we've seen enough to realize that there is no lesser among evils. And there's an election coming up, and I'm saying again to the younger generation, if you get together, you can unseat these two pachyderms who think that they are there permanently to merely to dance musical chairs all over the place, to recycle themselves, to pretend to some kind of program. Look at the two political parties which are there. Can you distinguish between the two? I'm talking about the two who think they're the only parties, PDP and APC. Is there any discernible difference now? They've crossed and crisscrossed each other so much that I no longer even remember which individual belongs to which. And so I continue to say to the younger generation, for heaven's sake, get your act together. This may be the time if you are serious, when you can actually change the course of that nation. Beyond that, what else can one say?
Hello. Okay, thank you, Professor Soyinka, for your interesting keynote. My name is Wendo from Kenya, and in the course of your address, you painted a grim picture. This is because you indicated that you have ideas which can help to check some of the problems, for example, regarding the question of migration, but nobody is ready to listen to you. I know when it comes to nation building, there are many players, the intelligentsia, the clergy, the politicians, but what happened such that the leadership has assumed such a pivotal role whereby it can also ignore the views or advice of people like you, Professor. And possibly, what do you think can be done? Because in most cases, we've been told that when we go to workshops, not even the assembly, that we go to talk shop, and whatever we deliberate and come up with will never inform policy. So what do we do? Thank you.
Problem with my hearing aid, yes. Yeah, yes, I wonder. You know, it's always more honorable and dignified to take an initiative on one's own behalf, for one's own salvation. This is the lesson which I hope we can keep stressing to African leadership, to say, if you don't do this, others will do it for you. And they will do it in a way which will humiliate you as leaders. It's one of the ways in which I think this kind of pressure can be exerted, because they're not all, shall we say, they're not all negative. Some of them are very conscious, and we can work through those who are conscious of what is happening. We shouldn't wait until foreign nations tell us, all right, we'll allow you only 10 people out of your country. Once the quota is finished, sorry, we are locking our gates, no more. We can make them ashamed with images of boatloads of our humanity being rescued in the Mediterranean and drowning. The burial grounds of African would-be migrants in Lampedusa, in what's the name of those other islands, they're beginning to dedicate cemeteries for bodies washed ashore. And I think we must get to say where we push those images in the faces of leadership to say, is this what you represent? Is this how you represent yourselves to your own people? Is this the image of Africa, which even the children of the other world, the rest of the world, carry with them, grow up with, through a prism through which they now view any African? Is this really what you think our position should be? So it's a multi-directional kind of assault. As I said earlier, I happen to know that suggestions have been made and in some cases accepted that there should be a meeting between the two sides. And I know that if conditions, and these people don't really want to go and expose themselves to the vultures of the desert. No, They don't want to drown the Mediterranean Sea. If the conditions, that's why I said it begins with the economy here. If the conditions are made which offer at least a modicum of professional, occupational self-fulfillment here, who is going to start tripsing? It's not a pleasure ride. There's a book which has just come out, which I hope, it came out just as I was about to leave Nigeria, by Segun Adeniyi, in which he recounts the experience of his brother after several attempts to cross the Sahara, to go by boat. He recounts the most horrific forms of death: enslavement, forced prostitution, gang raping, casual disposition of our humanity, both across the desert and even sometimes after they've crossed the Mediterranean. And I think mobilizing through organizations like CODESRIA, NGOs, and collaborating with those I call the progressive elements in Europe will eventually lead to a concerted action. I don't see why a 5-year plan cannot be made, for instance, which compel our government to say, let's set this percentage of the resources of each nation, percentage, aside, specifically for the purpose of a kind of Marshall Plan, which creates employment across the continent. What is wrong with that? If they could do it, the Marshall Plan could take place from the America to the rest of Europe, shooting up a devastated nation like Japan after the war, Germany after the war. If that can take place, I don't see why. I mean, do we have half a head? Can't we see models? This thing is, nobody's suggesting anything original. No. We're just saying, for heaven's sake, look around you. This is nothing new. And people have found solutions. Why can't we not on this continent? So it's pressure, pressure, pressure all around.
Merci beaucoup. Je voulais réagir au frère nigérien qui a dit que les gens rient de la tragédie. C'est vrai, il y a un proverbe, un dicton en arabe qui dit « Le malheur fait pleurer, mais quand il y en a trop, il fait rire ». Oui. Oui, pardon. Oui. Je répète. En réaction au frère nigérien qui a dit que, excusez-moi, les gens rient de la tragédie, ça me fait évoquer un dicton arabe qui dit que le malheur fait pleurer, mais quand il y a trop de malheur, on en rit. Mais pour revenir à notre discussion, j'aimerais évoquer une image, une métaphore, à partir d'une fable très ancienne. Un jour, le loup a été blessé et au sol, avec ses blessures saignantes, les mouches sont venues et ont commencé à sucer son sang. Le renard, voyant que c'était une bonne affaire, est venu le voir et lui a dit « Est-ce que je peux t'aider ?» Et le loup, flairant le malin, lui dit « Non, merci, les mouches vont être repues et elles vont partir et j'espère me relever. » Je ne connais pas la fin de l'histoire, mais elle nous invite à imaginer cette fin et à réagir. Merci.
Thank you, Prof, for that invigorating presentation that uses both the human capacity to laugh, but at the same time to think very deeply. My name is Unalen Nasseralwani. I come from the Republic of Botswana, that desert called the Kalahari. I have over time come to realize that very often, I suppose because of the role of the state in its initial attempt to drive development on the continent of Africa, that we tend to leave too much in the hands of the state, when in fact the state does not have great respect for its citizens, because we don't have the same amount of power vis-a-vis our state as others who can offer a few dollars and the state is captured in various forms. That it is time for us as citizens of this continent to appreciate that whatever we do, it must come from what this particular individual can do, to mobilize other individuals. When CODESRIA can reach a point where at the General Assembly, the next generation of African scholars does not present academic papers, research papers, where they then come off with a list of what governments must do by way of policies, but actually look at what young African scholars must be doing themselves to make change, then we have greater hope of actually changing. Yes, we can embarrass our government. It's amazing how most of those in state power are not easy to embarrass. We can give them pictures, but the dollar talks much more sweetly than any embarrassment we can cause. At the end of the day, as my ancestors have always said, it's always on your shoulders as an individual to take that one small step. We have a saying in Setswana that when you urinate alone, that urine dissipates into the sand. But when there are a lot of people actually urinating in the same place, you actually have a stream. So it is time we started, all of us, to say, what am I? What is my responsibility? Thank you, Chair.
I absolutely agree with you. And with your permission, whenever I'm lecture next, I would like to borrow that analogy of yours, metaphor, which appeals to me tremendously. And I know what I'm going to do next I go into a urinal.
Okay. I'm just recognizing two people, one Rashid and the sister there.
Yeah, my name is Ismail Rashid. Thank you very much, Professor Wole Soyinka, for your wide-ranging lecture. I want you to talk a little about difference in Africa. I mean, and to use the cool term, tribalism, especially among people like us, the educated elite. And when we gain access to or close to power, the way in which we mobilize our, I don't want to use the word primordial identities, because sometimes we don't have primordial identities. We tack to primordial identities. I want you to talk a little more about the way in which difference identities, whether or not we call it ethnic or tribal identities, we call them religious identities, or we call them regional identities, are really piling up the bodies in different parts of the continent. I mean, Nigeria, where you're based, is an example. Almost every region that you see in Nigeria, people are either mobilizing religious identity or they're mobilizing ethnic identity to basically slaughter each other. When we look at the various electoral cycles in Africa, again, I talk to us because we're moving to, or we're now at a point in most parts of the African continent where the professors, where the doctors, where the so-called intelligentsia are in power. And what they have done repeatedly in countries after countries is to mobilize, is to look for, quote unquote, their people to mobilize power and to deploy power against each other. Can you comment on that a little?
Thanks. Ethnic identities or quote-unquote nationalism, very often it depends who's speaking. 2 points I'd like to remind you about. One, this phenomenon you're talking about is not peculiar to the African continent. In Europe, the tribes are still at war. And they're still asking for their quote-unquote national identities. Whether you're talking about the Irish, or you're talking about the Basques, or recently the Catalonians, who want their own distinct identity. The Scots how many years ago, had a referendum to break away long before Brexit, and then Brexit then, exacerbated the situation. It's a question of how ethnicity is used, and I agree with you there. There have been horrendous situations in this. Part of the drawback in development has been the negative use of ethnic identities. Culture can be a very strong force for general mobilization. And by culture, I'm talking about cultures, because, for instance, we don't have an African culture. We have African cultures. Various cultures were brought together by the colonial mandate, cohabiting within the same national zone. So we forced to stay together. Some managed to say, okay, no, let's reverse this process. Eritrea, Ethiopia. Recently, I think there was agitation in the Cameroon also. You have a portion, the Bakassi, who is saying they want to come back into Nigeria after having left Nigeria. And so this is a normal process. Leadership, the major task rests on leadership. I agree with our sister there, by the way, but ultimately, those who decide these things, these policies, those who push it one way or the other, it ends up with leadership. In Nigeria, we've been talking about restructuring the nation, restructuring that nation in a more meaningful way, decentralizing. And then the next thing, what you hear is, this country must not be broken up. It'll happen only over my dead body. The people are saying, just restructure it. It's not working. It's not functioning. It'll function more practically, more intelligently, if we reverse even some of the state divisions which we have made ourselves, and necessarily even go all the way back to the colonial intervention and saying that, all right, let's stay together, but for heaven's sake, let's make new internal arrangements. You make those arrangements, then you have statism as opposed to ethnicity. And right now, we also have state competitions. Whereas this can be a positive thing when there is a sense of productive, creative rivalry, and this has been stressed. Then, of course, each one wants to outdo the other, but not by decimating the population of the other side. So much depends, you're right, on the intelligentsia, on civic forces, the ability of a new generation to come together and overcome the negative use to which ethnic reality has been put. The Soviet Union till tomorrow. What is driving Putin and Ukraine? It's all tribalism. Gone back to their original national, cultural, political entities, and the man at the center doesn't like it. Same thing is what's happening in Nigeria. Once these people get into power, even if before they were saying, yes, let's restructure, they get there, they say, why should I restructure? Centralist power is very good for those at the top of the pyramid. And that is our problem, this constant dynamism which goes a long way to defeating the very purpose of cohabitation and peaceful development. It's a serious issue, I agree with you, and I don't have any immediate solution.
We have time for only 2 more questions or comments. I just want to see the hands around, and I know I've seen that, and Okay, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Je m'appelle Ngo Chibambe, enseignant à l'université de Lubumbashi, Congo. J'ai deux questions. La deuxième question m'est proposée par madame à côté. La première question. Wole Soyinka, je vous ai lu lorsque j'étais encore étudiant dans les années 80. Dans mon université, on avait seulement une belle expression qu'on gardait de vous, que les tigres ne chantent pas la tigritude, les tigres sautent sur sa proie. Mais dans votre communication vers la fin, je vous ai entendu encore parler sur la négritude, je vous ai entendu parler sur Ubuntu comme un capital intellectuel qu'il faut mobiliser. Entre les idées et l'action, de quoi l'Afrique a besoin? Est-ce que vous aussi nous proposez une théorie d'action pour le vrai changement, au lieu que vous tombiez dans, non pas le piège, mais dans les discours sur le Ubuntu? Voilà brièvement ma question. J'avale la deuxième question. Merci.
I know where you're headed. And I'm not going to take the bait. For me, the important thing is let's recognize the fact that, for me, values are permanent. Cultures are dynamic. Values are embedded in cultures. They extract from culture as well as from history. And I think Africa has enough of both negative history and negative culture, as well as positive history and positive culture to choose from, to winnow down, to extract the essence of and use it in a contemporary, to confront contemporary actualities. Nothing more sophisticated, not more complicated is required from us. And of course, naturally, to use it for practical development. Because ultimately, I happen to agree with Sembene Usman, since we heard it that way. I'll limit myself to saying, Usman said, "Négritude ne nourrit pas." He was right and he was wrong. Because there's also the expression, man shall not live by bread alone. And it's a combination of the two, I think, which present us as pragmatic people who are also immersed in a nation's culture. Desmond Tutu uses expressions like Ubuntu. Others use expressions like African Renaissance. We've had the phonies who use expressions like authenticité, and authenticité meant for them owning streets in Belgium and carrying off the entire mineral resources of the nation and having carton loads, container loads of champagne stamped with our images and breakfasting, washing our teeth with that. That's their notion of authenticity. Africa, then, where are they today? But look at the damage that they left behind. So that's what I mean by extracting from our history and our authentic cultures things which are positive and which assist us in a contemporary world. The name you want to give it, give it. You want to stick with negritude, you stick with negritude. You want to stick with tigritude, you stick with tigritude. Are you satisfied now?
Five hands, I can only pick one.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor Soyinka. My name is Sebastian Rwengabo from Uganda. It would seem to me that from your presentation and the reality of us swimming and being swallowed up by sharks in these oceans, and our failure to respond to it, that we have a problem of developing some minimum level of consciousness, both as a people, as nation states, and as Africans, that would then help us to appreciate what we have, appreciate the opportunities and challenges we face, and find ways of addressing them, in order then that we may be able to say, if I have to cross this ocean, I have to cross it with dignity. And again, because certain levels of collective consciousnesses cannot emerge spontaneously, they have to be either structurally imposed or progressively and deliberately developed in a society by the leadership. What, in your opinion, explains the elusiveness of this minimum level of consciousness about our self-dignity and self-confidence as a people? Thank you.
Elusiveness.
Hmm?
It eludes us.
Well, power, and I know you use the word leadership, and that's the correct. That's what those who put themselves forward as representatives of a people's power, will, volition, vision, etc., yes, it should be leadership. Unfortunately, we have a problem where leaders only think of power. Then they think of power, they think of self-perpetuation. Again, when I make these statements, I recognize exceptions. You know, take it for granted. And those ones we try to move close to, we try to use their examples to others. But I'm afraid we have some very, very backward leaders who totally misunderstand the nature of leadership, who cannot distinguish between, for instance, authority, which is given, and power, which is usually taken, is intoxicating, and it's simply deleterious to the human condition, the human self-respect. Some people think dignity is an elusive expression. I remember one of our representatives, it took ages before I could bear to talk to him again. And he was on the podium of the United Nations. And people were being killed in Nigeria, being undergoing kangaroo trials and being hanged for agitating. People were being tortured every day. And he goes on the podium of the United Nations and said, this dictator, this leader, you know, he is sanitizing banks. He's building roads. He's repairing potholes in the roads. And people are talking of human rights. And I'm quoting, he said, human rights, is this something we can put in a plate and eat? You know? You see? This is a man who's trying to put food on the table. And people are telling me human rights. It's an educated person, a friend of mine who sort of made up saying educated and representative, very high level. And I asked myself, this is an intellectual. He himself is a leader. He's talking to a concourse of humanity. I don't care who they are. And you're saying in effect, human dignity, because human rights equate human dignity for me. Volition is for me the ultimate expression of human dignity. And you're saying that volition, human rights, is something not worth fighting for. But we know also that some people guard their human rights. In fact, they appropriate the human rights of others. When you talk about human rights, lack of dignity, lack of human rights, actually you're saying that what a certain section has lost has been misappropriated by another section of the same humanity. So it's a struggle. For me, it's not even a balance. We know that if the citizen is made to feel part of the entire process of production, of governance, can actually see accountability in leadership, that citizen becomes more productive than when he's corralled and treated just like a beast a burden, like some inconsequential entity within society. And so the two things go together. As one American leader once said, of another aspiring leader, said, "He's the only American I know who cannot walk and chew gum at the same time." I insist that Africans can walk and chew kola nut at the same time.
We shall have a vote of thanks by Nana Anyidoho.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, members of the 15th CODESRIA General Assembly, it is my honor to express yours and my own appreciation to Professor Wole Soyinka, African intellectual and leader, Nobel Laureate, poet, novelist, essayist, playwright, orator, public intellectual, for this lecture. This is a long-awaited privilege, as Professor Soyinka himself said. CODESRIA first had a day to hear him speak in Maputo some 13 years ago. It was worth the wait. And perhaps it was destined that we should be gathered here in Senegal, Senghor's home, to hear the Leopold Sedar Senghor lecture. I doubt there's anyone here who has not engaged in some way with your work or with the legacy of your work. I myself first met you through your poem, The Telephone Conversation, which tickled me as a child before I understood the weight of the subject matter. Then as a student in secondary school, I was part of a production of your play, The Lion and the Jewel. I had only a small part, but I still remember my lines 30 years later. Later on, I was challenged by your essays to think more deeply about who I am as an intellectual, an academic, as a citizen of Africa and the world, and what that means, what responsibilities come with that. And today I have the privilege of listening to your lecture and being part of this conversation that we've just had. Others here will have their own stories about how they've encountered the range of your work. I can't think of any other intellectual who speaks to us in so many forms in our diversity and in our different moments. So, Professor Soyinka, on behalf of CODESRIA, of all of us on the continent whom you delight and stimulate to thought with your words, whom you challenge and inspire by your life, thank you. Eshe.
Let me also add to the word of thank you. I think we are belaboring a point here that doesn't need to be belabored. Professor Soyinka needed to wait for 13 years until I invite him before he could come. And to do that, I knew who to talk to. Having friends is important, because I was a part of a meeting at the University of Johannesburg close to a year and a half ago when Professor Soyinka presented a lecture, and I was looking very closely at his friends. And one of them turned out to be my friend also. So I started claiming the friendship and tightening it and saying one day when I want to have Professor Soyinka at CODESRIA, Dr. Pinky Megwe was going to make it possible. And she did make it possible. So I would like to invite Dr. Pinky Megwe to present this little gift to Professor Soyinka. As I said previously, we essentially are branding ourselves in your home or your office. So we appreciate your presence and really thank you very much for allowing us to host you and for presenting this lecture. Thank you very much. So we come to the end of the first session this morning. We will take a quick tea break and then resume in 30 minutes. Thank you very much.